But that news from federal court in D.C. today broke just before we got this ton of bricks dropped by the New York Times. A several thousand-word piece on the front page of the Times as of this afternoon that is basically an omnibus look at obstruction of justice issues this White House and this president may ultimately have to answer for someday, somehow, in the Russia investigation. Everything from one of the president's Russia lawyers reportedly offering pardons, presidential pardons, to Mike Flynn and Paul Manafort after each of them had been charged, and while each of them were making important decisions about their potential testimony or their potential cooperation deals with prosecutors. Presidents, of course, have the right to pardon anyone they want to pardon, but if the president, through his legal team, was explicitly dangling pardons to potential witnesses for the purpose of dissuading those witnesses from providing evidence that might hurt himself or his administration or his family or his business, well, that's quite a different matter. And that's just one of them. I mean, the New York Times today runs down the whole gamut, from the pardon offers to Flynn and Manafort to the president's efforts to coordinate with congressional Republicans to help them in their efforts to publicly undermine and disparage Mueller and his investigators. Not to mention Trump's efforts to try to fire the special counsel himself and his multiple efforts to try to pressure then Attorney General Jeff Sessions into influencing the Justice Department's behavior in these investigations, and his multiple efforts to fire Attorney General Jeff Sessions, specifically because he wasn't getting what he wanted from him on the Russia matter. At one point, the president, according to the New York Times today, the president called Corey Lewandowski and asked Corey to please fire Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General. Think about the lengths that means the president will go to avoid firing someone face to face. I mean, Corey Lewandowski didn't even work at the White House. On what grounds was he in a position to fire the Attorney General of the United States? I don't know, but the New York Times reports today that he asked him to. Okay. I mean, eventually, if you're doing that, like, why not just call people who you like who are like talk radio hosts? You know what I mean? Like, hey, buddy, would you fire the Attorney General for me? I'll send you a note. Like, what? On what basis? Anyway. So like I said, long piece released by the New York Times today. It's basically a ton of bricks in terms of obstruction of justice issues and the president and the Russia investigation. We know, for example, from the Watergate era, that obstruction of justice issues were front and center in the impeachment articles that were ultimately brought against Nixon, and that led to his resignation. So that's important stuff. And it's, I think, important to have it all laid out in one piece and in context. But there are two pieces of this that are either brand new or largely new tonight, that aren't just, you know, a look back at stuff we had previously learned. They're new. These are new things, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of them over the course of this hour. One is about the federal prosecutor's office in the Southern District of New York. So this is SDNY, right? This is the powerful U.S. Attorney's Office that's based in Manhattan. That prosecutor's office has been involved already in a lot of key investigations related to this administration. Investigations that have already spun all the way out, or some investigations that appear to be still underway. For example, it's prosecutors from the Southern District of New York who subpoenaed the Trump Inaugural Committee a couple of weeks ago. It's prosecutors from the Southern District of New York who did that cooperation and non-prosecution deal with American Media, the publisher of the National Enquirer supermarket tabloid, and with its chief executive, the president's longtime friend, David Pecker. Southern District of New York prosecutors are also the prosecutors who brought charges against Michael Cohen, the president's longtime lawyer and a longtime executive at his real estate business. Charges against Cohen brought by the Southern District of New York include those campaign finance felonies in which SDNY implicated the president himself in directing the commission of those felonies. SDNY's involvement in all these Trump-related cases and SDNY's willingness explicitly to implicate the president in two felonies already in the Cohen case, going so far as to give the president the moniker Individual One in the Cohen case, those prosecutors being willing to spell out in court explicitly that Individual One is, in fact, the president of the United States and he directed the commission of these felonies. That forward-leaning posture for this U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York has led to recent speculation that that prosecutor's office might ultimately decide that they're going to ignore Justice Department internal policy which says you're not supposed to indict a sitting president while that president is still in office. Politico.com reported yesterday that there's growing speculation in legal circles that this prosecutor's office, SDNY, might be willing to defy that Justice Department policy. They might be willing to try to indict the president out of that office, since they are pushing up against that boundary anyway in the prosecutions they have already pursued. I will tell you right now, a bit of a programming note here, we're going to have an important addition to that story later on this week. Right now, we are working on a Rachel Maddow Show special report specifically on that subject because we've got something new on that subject that nobody else has. We are working on that already. We're going to have that report for you sometime in the next few days, as soon as it is ready. But on the Michael Cohen prosecution in SDNY, it had previously been reported that President Trump was furious about Cohen being prosecuted, furious about him being prosecuted in the way he was, in the way that implicated the president for those campaign finance felonies by New York federal prosecutors and for some of the other things that he'd been brought up on. CNN reported in December that on at least 2 occasions, the president had lashed out at acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, both about prosecutors implicating Trump in those campaign finance felonies and about Cohen being charged with lying to Congress about the Trump Tower Moscow. All right, so this was, I mean, Trump, I don't know if Corey Lewandowski helped, right? But finally, President Trump did somehow figure out a way to fire Jeff Sessions in a way that didn't scare him too much. He finally did figure out a way to get rid of Sessions. And so he brought in Matthew Whitaker to be the acting attorney general. And very soon thereafter, there were these reports that Trump was on the phone with Whitaker, calling him, reaming him out about what was going on with Michael Cohen. What was going on in that New York courtroom? What was going on with these prosecutors and what Cohen was admitting to? Whitaker was asked about these reports that he had been pressured by the White House about the Cohen prosecution. He was asked about these reports when he testified before the House Judiciary Committee a couple weeks ago. After his testimony, that committee's chairman, New York Democrat Jerry Nadler, wrote a letter to Whitaker that basically confronted him with the allegation that Whitaker had lied under oath to the committee when they had questioned him on that very subject. Quote, although the committee appreciates your decision to appear, members on both sides of the aisle found many of your answers to be unsatisfactory, incomplete, or contradicted by the evidence. Contradicted by other evidence. Quote, for example, our members asked you about reports that President Trump called you at least twice to express his frustration after Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, pleaded guilty in the Southern District of New York to lying to Congress and for arranging hush money payments on the president's behalf. Representative Cicilline asked you in the hearing directly, did the president lash out to you about Mr. Cohen's guilty plea? You responded, no, he did not. Representative Cicilline asked you again whether the president or anyone on the president's behalf had reached out to you in some way to express dissatisfaction. You responded, no. Quote, the committee has now identified several individuals with direct knowledge of the phone calls you denied receiving from the White House. As a result, we require your clarification on this point without delay. So we could sort of tell something was going on here, right? We had that report from CNN in December that the president had called his newly installed acting attorney general and said, hey, what are you going to do for me about this Cohen prosecution? This is really bothering me. Then we have Whitaker being asked about that under oath in front of the Judiciary Committee and him behaving quite cagily when he was asked about it. We then have that response immediately after the hearing from the committee chairman saying, we think you told an untruth to the committee. We think you did not speak accurately to the committee when you said the White House didn't call you to complain about the prosecution of Michael Cohen and his guilty pleas. We've got evidence that suggests those phone calls you were denying getting from the White House actually happened. So we could tell this was building to something. Well, now today, the New York Times has this, quote, as federal prosecutors in Manhattan gathered evidence late last year about President Trump's role in silencing women with hush payments during the 2016 campaign, Mr. Trump called Matthew G. Whitaker, his newly installed attorney general, with a question. He asked whether Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, who had been chosen for that job by President Trump, a former law partner of the president's own lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, he asked whether Jeffrey Berman could be put in charge of the widening investigation. the Times says, citing several American officials with direct knowledge of the call. Quote, Mr. Whitaker knew he could not put Mr. Berman in charge because Mr. Berman had already recused himself from the investigation. Quote, what exactly Mr. Whitaker did after this call from the White House is unclear. There's no evidence that he took any direct steps to intervene in the Manhattan investigation. He did, however, tell some associates at the Justice Department that prosecutors in New York required, quote, adult supervision. So, as I mentioned, we're going to have more coming up on this tonight. But this is potentially trouble for Matt Whitaker, who is no longer acting Attorney General, but who is staying at the Justice Department now that the new Attorney General, William Barr, has been sworn in. This is potentially trouble for Whitaker if his adult supervision comment means that he did try to influence that prosecution in New York at the behest of the White House. It's also trouble for Whitaker, obviously, if he did lie about those interactions under oath to Congress. It's also potentially trouble for the president if he was going after a federal criminal case, right? If he was trying to handpick a prosecutor for that case in order to try to protect himself. I mean, that's the kind of thing that theoretically could be prosecuted as a felony obstruction charge against a defendant, even potentially against a defendant who is a president, if the Southern District of New York was, in fact, inclined to try to pursue something like that. Again, we will have more on that to come, both over the course of this hour and later this week in our planned special report. But the other piece of this we need to talk about is this other big new revelation from this Times reporting, and it is about Michael Flynn. Michael Flynn was the first official fired at the brand new Trump White House. It didn't even make it a month. Michael Flynn then became the first guilty plea and the first cooperating witness in the Russia investigation. Michael Flynn then, surprised, just a few weeks ago, became the first Mueller defendant to have his sentencing hearing completely blow up in court when, among other things, the judge that was supposed to be sentencing him diverted into questioning prosecutors as to whether they had ever considered charging Mike Flynn with treason. Mike Flynn, to this day, is now cooperating with prosecutors. Sentencing got put off. He is awaiting a new sentencing date in federal court in Washington, D.C. But what we learned today from this New York Times reporting is actually a quite unexpected answer to what has been a persistent mystery about Mike Flynn since his story initially blew up less than 1 week into the Trump administration. We have finally got an answer to what happened there, and it is the opposite of what we expected. And that story's next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.